That's great. Next slide, please. I might just jump through to the next one. Okay. So look, I'll just begin by giving a brief overview of the program and respond to that question: what is the National One-Stop Shop? So the National One-Stop Shop is the overarching policy program, and there are multiple projects within that program that's underpinned by a national ICT solution. So as we were undertaking consultations, the One-Stop Shop became synonymous with the underlying ICT solution, but it really is relating to the broader policy program. And that program is being delivered by cross-jurisdictional governance arrangements under a group called the Intergovernmental Policy Reform Group. Now, this group emerged out of earlier iterations of cross-jurisdictional working groups that then became a uniform group that through which issues were sought to be addressed and projects or initiatives were delivered. This group is now enduring. It was announced by the Minister in October of 2023. And then as part of the funding that we received to undertake further technical work to deliver that ICT solution, there is also an arrangement to negotiate an intergovernmental agreement. So the arrangements for ongoing, enduring engagement of the jurisdictions to drive the national reform agenda are now in place and will be confirmed through that mechanism. So I've heard some people in the sector refer to this mechanism as a central office, a coordinating office. We refer to it as the overarching cross-jurisdictional governance through which all the reforms will be delivered. Next slide, please. Just to provide you with an overview of what that governance structure looks like. So you can see here that there is, this is the policy program structure. The secretariat for this structure is provided through the Australian Government Department of Health and Aged Care. The chair of the IGPRG is Professor Ian Chubb, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with him as the former Chief Scientist of Australia and Vice Chancellor of ANU. He's also a clinical trial participant and was the recipient of life-saving treatment. And so he's been working with us through the National One-Stop Shop consultations through 21 and 22, and is now the chair of the IGPRG. So we know that in a federation, what we achieve is not always through legislation, but rather by agreement with the states and territories. So that will be that overarching mechanism to achieve that agreement. And it's supported by a number of subcommittees. So in place at the moment, because since we received the funding to move forward with this work on the 1st of July of this year, we've been able to put those subcommittees in place and also engage staff within the team to support the secretariat functions. So we currently have in place our industry advisory group that comprises representatives from the commercial and medical research sector. We have the first meeting of our stakeholder advisory group, which is actually quite a large group. Over 30 organisations are represented in that group, and that's across the health and medical research sector, MRIs, universities, community stakeholder groups, and then there are other reference groups within that group as well. We also have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ethics committees and health services represented in that group. And again, there's an additional reference, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander reference group. We also have a tender advisory group, and they are jurisdictional representatives that have been informing the work. Many of you will know that we did undergo a request for expression of interest for solution design and costing options from the commercial sector in July and August of this year, and that group is advising us on that process. And then internally, we report up through the structures within the Department of Health, through our Assistant Secretary, First Assistant Secretary, through to the board. So we have a board that sits across the IT groups within the Department of Health, and then we also report to the Health Minister through that mechanism, and then back up through to the IGPRG. Next slide, please. So what are the projects currently under the umbrella of the broader program? We have the implementation of the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework. So we are the policy leads. The jurisdictions, they are the policy owners of that piece of work. They are also the regulators of our health system. And across the private sector, under the National Health Insurance Act, they are required to comply with standards. So, of course, the governance framework also applies to them. So we're also building a team within the Department of Health to support implementation of that framework to ensure that it is implemented as intended, and as all health ministers agreed. So we're onboarding a team shortly on the 16th of December, actually. Our next member of the team starts with us to help deliver that work. We also have a project to harmonise the systems and processes, as you know, and we receive that funding to drive through the National One-Stop Shop work to deliver the platform. And a number of your questions that have come through, I might just sort of segue into those here. So it's one of the questions is, my understanding is that the One-Stop Shop will require institutions to adopt a standardised ethics application process. So yes, the system will enable that harmonisation of the ethics application process. Another question relates to, is the HREC being adopted? So the work that we're doing underway, and we've engaged funded SMEs through the jurisdictions and others as well, and I'm sure some of you will have participated in the workshop so far, is to refine the ethics application workflow and the data fields that we're currently following. Look at what technologies we can use to streamline or simplify that process. So we will all be working through one platform. All the jurisdictions have agreed to retire their existing systems and move to the platform once it's built. And that through that mechanism, we will also be operationalising the local site authorisation process. So it will be mandatory for everyone in the jurisdictions. It will be the single national system. It will be open to the public and private sector, not-for-profit, aged care that currently don't have any system through which to operate. All health services, regional and remote services, and we know that in some jurisdictions currently health services don't have a system through which to make an application. The Commonwealth will also be using this platform, and there'll be the common SSA elements. So we've already done the consultations with the sector to refine and agree those core data fields. The process will also be described through the system, and that has also been agreed and is published in the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework. So even in the workshops we're doing now, we're hearing that people are still trying to adjust that SSA process. So there will be a common process. Data fields that are common across the HREC will also be fed into the SSA, and yes, it will be a single form and a single workflow. So from this single workflow, and I might touch on that on my next slide, actually, I'll focus on that more. Moving to the next piece of work that the program will be delivering is the quality standard that Michael will speak to shortly. And we're also updating guidance for the sector on teletrials, including decentralised trials, and looking at what better support we can provide to regional and remote Australia. And we'll be putting that up to the Commonwealth as well as part of our business case. Next slide, please. So what is the platform? It is a single workflow. So that it's underpinned by the principle that information coming through the platform will be used in multiple components and functions of the platform. So it will begin with a research application. It will, as I said, enable concurrent site-specific authorisation. It will be integrated with the TGA to enable their CTA and CTN processes as well as payments. Ultimately, the workflow will end at the trial unit. And what it will enable the trial unit to do is to have what is currently referred to as clinical trial a management system. We're going to call it research management functionality. So sites will be able to manage all their research through this system. So as a new trial is approved and authorised at the site, it will become live in the trial unit, and they will be able to manage all of their visits. They'll be able to invoice through the system, and they'll be able to, really importantly, report and meet their reporting requirements against the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework. Ultimately, it will replace ANZ CTR, and it will become the new National Research Registry. So it will meet the minimum WHO requirements for publishing a clinical trial. It will maintain that existing connection with clinicaltrials.gov, so that integration will be enabled through the platform. And then as a flow on, that there will be this public-facing website for the community where information will be made available in plain language for the community as well as in other languages. It will replace existing jurisdictional systems. So the new CTMS is what we're calling the research management functionality with real-time monitoring and reporting. So that's the component that will be made live in every trial unit in any health service organisation that is conducting research, so that you can use it for your clinical trials, you can use it for all the health research that you are undertaking. Next slide, please, Lawrence. Okay, just go back to that last slide. And what I might do, I can see lots of questions coming through the chat, and I don't want to eat into Michael's time. So what I might do is go to the questions that have come through and then perhaps hand to Michael, and then maybe we can come back to some of the questions. So the technical work that we've been asked to undertake as part of the funding that we received included 4 concurrent phases. So over the 12 months, the funding that we got was not to build the platform, but it was to undertake further design work through the sector. And we've done that through a series of workshops. So we've had phase 1 workshops where we've again come back to you to understand any changes with existing systems and processes. Have you implemented a new system apart from the systems that we already know about? We've also finished phase 2, which is testing back with the SMEs that we've been speaking to around their future state requirements. And then phase 3 we'll be undertaking from about February to May of next year. We've also onboarded additional members to the team as part of our delivery foundation. We have built a proof of concept in the research management component of the platform, and we've taken it back to the sector to test with you through that design phase, that research management component. So we fully understand any complexity associated with that, including potential to integrate with financial systems. So an integration could be as complex as integrating fully with a financial system, or it could be as simple as publishing an API. So we've undertaken that piece of work as well. We also undertook an open approach to market to test the market to see if there are any technologies out there that we're not familiar with, or is there anything new that we haven't considered as part of building our very first proof of concept, which we brought to you as a domain services architecture, so an agnostic approach to delivering the technology solution. That closed, and we received some really good responses to that, almost 20 responses through that process, and we're evaluating those now. Now, the reason you do an REI is to cast the net wide, to understand what commercial solutions are out there. That doesn't commit the government to entering into a contract or selecting a supplier from that process. It really is an exercise in casting the net wide, and that is what we promised the jurisdictions we would do as part of that process. And then we're gathering those options as well as other options that we'll put forward to government for their consideration in how we might deliver that platform and who would host it. And we, as you know, through the consultation process, we didn't hear there was any preference from the sector for the platform to be hosted anywhere else except within the Commonwealth environment. So those are the pieces of work that we've been delivering as for consideration by government. And we are hoping to go back to government with our business case for their consideration and come back to you with an outcome of that determination. So in terms of when will the the platform be delivered. That's still a work in process, but I think we should be able to come back to you in the medium term with an outcome. Will there be support for regional and rural Australia? That is actually a key priority as part of this work, to make sure that all sites have equitable access to the platform and the benefits that it will deliver, that there will be additional support for clinical trials being delivered through teletrials and decentralised models. So all of that is part of what we're putting up to the Commonwealth for them to consider. Lawrence, would you like me, or Sophie, would you like me to pause there and hand to Michael and come back to questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think let's leave the questions for the panel's discussion. I feel like there's a lot of questions, but a lot of them are in the same sort of ilk, so we can address them all then.
Thanks so much. I'll hand over to Michael. He has a separate presentation. Thanks so much.
Okay, great. Can everyone see the presentation? Fantastic. All right. I'm going to talk to you briefly about quality standards and an accreditation scheme for human research ethics committees and their host institutions, of course. So thank you very much for the invitation to speak, Sarah, Gordon, and Sophie. I'd also like to thank Jeremy for not only for working with us on the quality standards, but also for eloquently describing the processes that we have to deal with in doing these reforms every day. So thanks very much, Jeremy, and also and Bernadette as well for outlining the background to the project. Could I have the next slide, please? And again. Great. Okay, so the issue that we're dealing with, or we're tasked with really, is dealing with inconsistency and lack of confidence in HREC review and approval processes limits their acceptability by institutions and across jurisdictional borders. And so we are looking to develop quality standards and an accreditation scheme that would enhance the consistency and efficiency of the review processes and really build that reciprocal confidence that we feel is lacking in HREC review. We're also very keen to support mutual acceptance. So not just through the NMA scheme, but in the future, we're hoping that this mutual acceptance would be expanded to include accredited institutions and their HRECs across the public, private, and potentially university sectors nationally. Next slide, please. Oh, I did forget to say, sorry, that by inconsistency, there are comments and questions coming through the chat, but what we mean by this inconsistency is really the differences in the committee operations and the differences in expertise and the lack of transparency. Also, there's a variable access to different experts as well between committees, and there are different policies and procedures, as you know, that are in place between jurisdictions. There are even different ethics submission systems, as you know. So our progress to date, what we have done is we have reviewed quality standards and accreditation schemes that exist internationally for HRECs, and there's a literature review that's available online if you're keen to read that. We've also undertaken a standards mapping exercise by looking at what various standards exist and how they relate to what's in use in Australia. And this allowed us to come up with draft quality standards for HRECs under the National Mutual Acceptance Scheme. These were endorsed for targeted consultations with the health and human research sector in the middle of last year, and we conducted these consultations in a targeted fashion, as well as follow-up consultations with specific stakeholders too. And then with the recent funding announcement for the National One-Stop Shop, and to align it with these other health and medical research reforms, this project was brought back to the Department of Health and Aged Care in the middle of this year. And we have been through a consultation report and re-established our advisory group within the department. We've also had some discussions around the project's scope, and this has led us to reconsider our initial focus on NMA ethics committees and to adopt a broader scope which would apply to health and medical research. We are planning to conduct public consultations on these quality standards and the proposed options for the accreditation scheme in the new year. And the new quality standards, as they are referred to, are now called draft quality standards for HRECs and their host institutions. Could I have the next slide, please? All right, so that's the original version of the quality standards, but now with the focus really on a wider health and medical research HRECs, these standards were co-designed with IGPRG and the Ethics Committee Advisory Group, which we have an independent chair who is leading an advisory group that is academic and industry and jurisdictional representatives. We have 3 broad standards, each with actions underneath them, and they, as you'll see, most of them really apply to the institution which resources and establishes and supports the HREC. And only really that 3rd standard applies to the HREC itself. Each action contains explanatory notes and suggested strategies that an institution or an HREC would be implementing to meet the standard, and examples of evidence that could be used in an accreditation scheme to show that that standard has been met. These standards are closely aligned with the national statement and particularly Section 5 and other relevant guidelines, including the Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research, but mostly the national statement. Next slide, please. So a couple of things we wanted to test through our targeted consultations were whether participating institutions should have a mechanism like a staffed research office or an equivalent to really ensure that the research is being conducted in accordance with the national statement and other relevant guidelines. This centralized research office could also offer that research support function and that pre-review or pre-submission review of research proposals, because some of the feedback we've had from HRECs themselves, in fact, is that the quality of the applications isn't always what is required, or often there are applications that are unnecessarily coming to be reviewed by the HREC. So we're looking to have some sort of triage, and we have heard some description of that early on in the conference on Wednesday about having that pre-submission review and that triage process. So this could be performed by a staffed research office or a similar mechanism. Looking overseas, we have also heard about, and also from Lisa Eckstein the other day, about these workshops or forums for institutions and HRECs to take part in to share their quality assessment findings, really, and to understand how they respond to a particular application and how their opinion sits with their peers, really. So that's something we wanted to test as well, as the appetite for that type of exercise. Also, there's currently not a consistent national policy or guidance for HREC members for disclosure of interest and management of potential conflicts of interest. There is some description in the code about that, but not explicitly for HREC members. We're also looking at institutions, the possibility of them training their HREC members, not just in conflicts of interest, their identification and management, but also in cultural safety, which, as you know, involves reflecting on our own cultural identity and addressing some of those interpersonal power differences that may occur in the research setting. But what's really important about cultural safety is that its presence or absence is defined by the recipient. And so in the research setting, this would be the research participant or perhaps the patient. And so we really need that feedback loop and that input from research participants, from patients, from the community, in fact, into whether these cultural safety efforts have been appropriate and if they've been effective. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so within these targeted consultations, we were talking about how we might assess the quality of an ethics review beyond these quantitative measures, like looking at the HREC's workload and the number of applications and how quickly they're reviewed. Also, we wanted to know how the effectiveness of the HREC's deliberations could be determined. We asked participants about remuneration for HREC members and whether the appointments of HREC members should be reviewed, and should we think about having time limits for HREC members. Also, an issue that came up repeatedly was about how the HREC's decision-making processes need to be independent of the host institution, and how can we ensure that endures and is preserved in the HREC. And so are the provisions in the national statement enough to ensure that independence, or should we think about other things like having an independent chair or increasing the number of external members on the HREC, or changing reporting lines, for example? And then in the context of the national one-stop shop, as Bernadette has described, we wanted to ask about the appetite for greater standardization and consistency for ethics application and approval processes. Next slide, please. So I can share a couple of findings with you, and that is that we had about 800 invited to the consultations and 124 took part. We had about 65 responses for our consultation survey. The majority of respondents were either very likely or somewhat likely to recommend adoption of the quality standards. Regarding the quality of an HREC review, respondents indicated that these were instances where there'd been an adequate discussion of sufficient depth of the relevant issues, and of course that the decisions were made with close reference to the national statement. We're looking for a scientific review that's highly relevant to the application with, of course, that appropriate attention to detail. And of course, particularly within the NMA scheme, the review needs to be consistent with existing local policies to get that mutual acceptance anyway. Regarding the quality of an HREC, it's good to see when an HREC has used the full range of decisions that are available to it. So they're not approving everything and they're not rejecting everything, of course. And also that they are happy to refer things and happy to get external advice and to decline to review applications when they lack appropriate expertise. And something we're thinking about in an accreditation scheme is even for HRECs to indicate areas of research that they do not review, saying we don't have sufficient expertise for this type of thing. May I have the next slide, please? So the next steps, we are going to be conducting public consultations on the updated quality standards and the proposed models for this future accreditation scheme in early 2025. Of course, from the feedback from consultations will be incorporated into the quality standards. And we also need to seek that endorsement, not just from IGPRG, but also from our advisory group, that what we're proposing is feasible, is implementable, and is not too stringent as well, and accessible, because ultimately we'd like this to be quality standards for all HRECs to aspire to meet and to try to meet. And I think also I'd like to mention, I have heard a couple of times about the approach being conducted in Western Australia at the moment, and I'd really like to commend Vivian and Matt on this consolidation that's happening in WA and how well thought out it has been. So you're doing a great job there. Thank you. And then once we have that in place, then we can conduct a pilot of the scheme and so on. So thank you very much for your attention, and please look out for our public consultations early next year. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Lawrence, you've just stopped sharing your screen. Good, because I could see two of me and that wasn't nice. So we've got a number of questions from the chat and we now have our panelists up. So if I can get everyone on the panel, all the speakers, to turn on their cameras. And yeah, the chat was going off. So I think there was a theme to some of the questions. We tried to respond to some of them. Some of them probably need to direct their questions, have an email address to send their questions directly to you because they were quite specific. And so we might pop that up at the end for those questions. But what I will do is I will start with Viv and Matt. Do you have subcommittees that you're managing as well for lower risk review pathways?
So currently the Central HREC does not have a dedicated low risk review pathway. We're currently only focusing on those greater than low risk applications. And then as we move into 2025, we'll look at implementing a low risk review pathway. But because we're going to be holding a HREC meeting every week, we're not sure if it will be any quicker or if the frequency of meetings that we're holding will enable any kind of research application to be reviewed and a decision granted in a reasonable
expedited
period of time. There we go. Thank you, Jeremy. That it might not be necessary to have a dedicated low risk review pathway.
Okay, cool. That sounds reasonable. Are all your meetings held online, or are any of them face to face? And my HREC members are still missing the times when they got face to face. How did you firstly answer the first part? Are they all online?
No, they're going to be hybrid. So we do acknowledge that people are very busy, / we have quite a few members who are rural and remote, so it's not possible for them to come. But we will have a room available here at the WA Department of Health that people can come to if they like, because it is very beneficial to get people in the room when they can. And we know a lot of our members as well say that they like the opportunity to come in and actually speak face to face.
Yeah, I have to say we've done the same thing. We've made our meetings hybrid, and next year what we're going to do is run a couple of them only, like have them all on Zoom, and then encourage people to come into the couple of hybrid meetings we have, so that we get more people in on site. I think it's really difficult now not to run a hybrid meeting because, I mean, also for infection control, because if people do all this work and then they can't have access to a meeting because they've got a cold or something, or we're encouraging them to come in when they do, I think that's where we've landed. But it is, lots of our members miss the face-to-face interaction. I think it takes a bit of time for people to learn how to interact in a Zoom forum, as well as in person, and it really helps if they've got that personal connection first before working over Zoom. So yes, we're all still learning all the time. I don't know about anyone else, but it was a whole new, running the meeting was completely different when we had to run it online. We had to learn a lot. Viv, Matt, can you share your training for HREC members?
You guys go through that?
Yeah, so with the sort of training workshops, like I mentioned, we've got one running today that's actually coming out of Praxis at the moment, and they've helped to design a package for us, but we can definitely send information about sort of what package they put in terms of what topics they cover. And we have sort of mapped out sort of some training that we'd like to integrate for next year's calendar as well. And we've done a couple of other things during the last few months. So I can definitely send for a list of the ideas that we have planned for next year and sort of what we've done so far.
Great, thanks, Viv. Jeremy, so how often are the reviews and updates to the national statement, and who triggers an update if it's not on a regular schedule?
So when the 2007 version of the national statement was published, there was a decision made not to operate on scheduled, sort of Soviet style 5-year plans, but to do it based on the need. And that need could, as I said, arise from changes in the research sector, the ethics environment, either nationally or internationally. It could be requested by an individual person. That doesn't mean that we would accommodate that request. We obviously efficiencies were needed, but in theory it could be it could be any time. But what's happened is that there was a 2007, then there was a spate of changes around 14, 15, then there was the section 3 in 2018, then section 5 and chapter 2.1 in 2023. So it's leaning, as Gordon noted, it's sort of leaning toward a 5-year schedule anyway. So I would expect that we're not going to see anything new for that many years at a minimum, but we're not going to start a new review process. It's essentially been undergoing ongoing review for the last 8 years. And so we need to take a break.
Yep.
Not only for our staff, but also to allow everybody to integrate all the changes.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
There's a problem of change fatigue or exhaustion that we need to consider.
Okay, so will the NHMRC review the guidelines approved under Section 95 and 95A of the Privacy Act 1988, the category of persons at D5E are out of step? Yep.
Okay, so there's some debate in the chat about whether they are in fact out of date, inconsistent or not. But the answer to the question is that we are in discussions, as we have been for over a year, with the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner about who's going to be revising those guidelines. There was a very minor revision required in order to deal with what's called sunset clauses or whatever, in order to make sure that what was present and in place remained in place. But there's going to be a much larger review process. It's going to be driven by the OAIC, not NHMRC. And we don't know exactly who the author is going to be yet, but I'd put my money on OAIC as the authors of any new guidelines.
Do you think that they will consult with research ethics and governance officers, or if there's a way that we can encourage them to consult with research ethics and governance
Well, one
officers?
of our pieces of input to them will be that it's necessary to consult with that group of stakeholders. As we know, the original privacy guidelines were written largely without the input of researchers, which is what created some of the problems that we currently have. Not the least of which is the assigning of responsibilities to HRECs that weren't necessarily best carried out by those bodies, but there were limited alternatives at the time. You have to remember that this was all 20 years old or more, and that the world has changed and the guidelines have not been revised to accommodate the changes in the environment. So a lot big issues here, big space. This also connects to the whole waiver issue, and I'll stop there.
Thanks, Jeremy. And importantly, is there an intent to put the bookmarks back in?
No.
Makes it easier to navigate.
No, I'm afraid not, because we have found that the way to put the bookmarks in is through the HTML format. An HTML format of national statement was being continually corrupted without the use of the human hand. In other words, the IT infrastructure, the system itself was occasionally leading to corruptions in the document, and so we do not want to publish the national statement in HTML form. However, you know that with any PDF document, you can simply tick bookmarks and you'll find bookmarks, on the left-hand column. They might not be as specific as you might like, but they'll be there. Also, of course, you can download it and insert anything you want. But we will be publishing it on our website only in PDF format.
Thank you, Jeremy. And Gordon's got his hand up. What would you like to say, Gordon?
Oh, thanks, Sophie. Oh, Jeremy, look, thanks for that. I mean, I must say that we would obviously really welcome the update to Section 4. And I guess the national statement itself does provide a lot of scope for deliberation and decision making. So let's hope it's broad enough to deal with the majority of cases that come up. You did make a comment about the HREA, and I suppose it is relevant to Bernadette's talk as well. I know that with the preponderance of information systems that and ones that are sort of bespoke, which embed the HREA, they find that they necessarily need to include different guidance. So, and a recent conversation with the NHMRC, as I understand it, fell short of satisfying the need to allow that guidance to be updated. So when you are doing the update to the HREA in line with the Section 4, will you be accommodating these other needs to inform better guidance, which will be required by some information management systems?
I'll change the verb in your sentence from accommodating to considering. That is, there is a logic, and Gordon, you were involved in the design of the HREA along with me and dozens of other people. There's a certain logic to the HREA that cannot be, or an integrity to the form that cannot be maintained if it's to be. If it's I don't know how to say this grammatically. If it's too bespoke, the whole point of the HREA is to be something that is standard and used by everybody in exactly the same
No, that's
form,
right. That's right. And of course, the incorporation of it.
So one of the just to insert the issue of guidelines, there are also a lot of guidelines in the HREA which people ignore, both with respect to specific questions, with respect to the development of project descriptions and protocols, with respect to whether certain issues of recruitment, and people simply don't ignore them, or the information systems that we have licensed with the companies that we've licensed with. The various jurisdictions have not included that guidance or not made it clear that it exists. So some of the guidance that people add is actually already present. It's just that people don't look at it. And then there's issues of whether guidance can be on top of the form without changing the form question logic itself. These are all complex issues. We will consider any input that we get. You should know that the National Mutual Acceptance crowd has we've worked with them several times to either make changes or to resist changes over time, and we will be considering their input as well. There's also potentially going to be work associated with a national one-stop shop that is an implication that implicates the work on the HREA, although not necessarily with respect to next year's modifications. But in the long term, the HREA might survive and it might not. There might be a completely new form that is built, or that the form may be completely rebuilt. But that's quite a ways down the line. So watch this space, I guess, is the
Yeah, no,
answer.
thanks, Jeremy, and thank you for considering it.
All right, I'm going to move on now. So these questions will be related to the one-stop shop, and a number of them were in the same theme. So if I don't ask your specific question, it's not because I've not seen it, it's just because I want to gather them together. So one was about the communication around the one-stop shop. So there's a question around how was this communicated, because I think some people in the chat it's the first time they've heard of it, and there were some specific groups who run HRECs who weren't aware. So they wanted to know, how was this communicated?
Oh, so thank you. So this is a piece of work, the one-stop shop specifically?
Yeah.
Sophie? Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is a piece of work that's been underway in the sector since 2021. So we ran national consultations with thousands of people, actually. The report, the outcome of those consultations is publicly available. It's the consultations were done in 2 phases. The first was to sort of document the current state, build a proof of concept, and then take that back and test that with the sector. And I appreciate that the sector changes. People move in and out of the sector. And so there is a piece of work that we're now embarking on to better communicate to the sector. And then we went back to the Commonwealth to obtain funding to deliver the platform, and we received money to undertake further design work. And so that came out of the last budget process. And so we've been onboarding a team since 1 July to assist with that design work. We present in multiple forums. I can't tell you how many presentations I do a year, but there are many. And so that's why it's so important for us to present in forums like this, because we're constantly reaching new people. So there will be a whole new communication and change and transition plan that we're embarking upon, but it is in the early stages of I guess, delivery and Commonwealth consideration of next steps. So would really love if we could have, I know this is a big call, 166 participants. If you would be happy to come either to the Australian Clinical Trials website and register to receive updates, or whether I can just provide this forum as a conduit to better access the sector.
I think that would be a good idea. And like I said, one way to manage this would be to have some contact information for your office. I don't know, Sarah's been putting a bunch of things in the chat, but I think if we could have a contact point so we can provide that to the people who have specific questions, that would be good.
I did find a contact, hrmr@safetyandquality.gov.au for any questions relating to the National One-Stop Shop.
Yeah. So the reason it's on that site is because that's where I was working at the time, and we were doing the finalisation of the piloting of the governance framework. And so the Commission was contracted to run those consultations. So they're not involved in the delivery of the one-stop shop. That's by the Department of Health, where I am now. And it's been delivered by the RGPRG with the support of the Department of Health. So the consultations were run through that agency, and that's why the report's currently on their website, but it will transition over to australianclinicaltrials.gov shortly.
Great, thanks, Bernadette. Now I'm trying to, so I want these two questions are similar. So are quality improvements and access requests going to be included? So an access request, I think New South Wales has a specific process for data access requests that also fall into that continuum of quality assurance and research. Is the system going to have capacity to support those sorts of requests?
Sorry, can you just say that again? You dropped out, Sophie.
Sorry. Okay, so the one of the questions is around access requests. So New South Wales have a system in place to do data access requests for these projects that fall on that continuum of quality assurance and research, which we know is a big continuum. They're wanting to know if there is going to be capacity within the system to support those sorts of projects.
Of course. So that's the work we're doing now to scope. You know, it's all health research coming through. So it's going to be the single national system. So it will be for all types of research, not just clinical trials.
Great. Yeah, because that was another theme that the universities were wondering if they were included. I think the answer is
now,
yes.
Universities can use it, but of course they undertake animal studies and all types of other research, education research, all sorts of. So it's not, we're not going to lock them out. They're welcome to use it, but we do appreciate they also have other systems and processes specific to that sector.
Okay. And the final question from this set was, will material agreements and material transfer agreements and non-clinical trial collaborative agreements sign off be available via the one-stop shop?
Yes. Yes.
Cool. Great.
So that's
Awesome. Now I had a few questions myself that were based
all right.
on.
I just want to say I have to jump onto another call at 1. So,
okay, no worries. We'll make them really quick. So we're all working really, really hard in this time of flux, the research ethics and governance officers in this space. What do you see the sustainability of our workforce? How do you see the sustainability of our workforce being impacted by the National One-Stop Shop and efforts to streamline things?
How will the sector be impacted?
Yeah.
Look, we're anticipating and we are really working to deliver a product that will be so good everyone will want to use it. It should make it easier for everyone to make a research application. There'll be greater visibility and transparency of the application process. There'll be in-system communication. So it won't be, an application that's then supported by ongoing communication via email. So the intention is that it does streamline, harmonise and make the whole process much easier for everyone. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing it.
But do you see from that more jobs being generated in different areas?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look, I think what it will do, I mean, we know that there's about 8,000 people. Well, we don't. I mean, that's kind of what we estimate from an industry perspective. The breadth of coordinator engagement, research governance officer, ethics committee secretary is probably much bigger. What it will provide is an opportunity, I think, for greater workforce utilisation across the country. We're all walking off the same system. Of course, there'll be jobs growth as we grow the industry. So we bring more health and medical research into this country. We do build an innovation pipeline, and there's other pieces of work to facilitate that. So yes, I that is an expected outcome of this work. Also, greater opportunities for sites that don't currently have maybe very high visibility with trial sponsors. They'll be able to see their capacity, capability, their performance, their level of accreditation, and so more sites will be attractive to sponsors so that we can increase access to clinical trials across the country.
Awesome. I think
I might have to
Bernadette, we'll see you later. Thanks so much for your participation. We really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Okay, Sarah, have I missed anything? You sent me a couple on the chat, or do you think that's covered the main themes? All right, I'm going to hand over. We're going to talk a little bit about waivers because everybody wants to talk about waivers, and there were a few questions in the pre-survey around waivers, and I think it's something we might explore a little bit more in a survey in the new year. And then I think we're planning another session in the new year in March. We've already got a date for. But Jeremy Kenner, I'm going to hand over. Oh, Sarah Hubbard.
Just very quickly, if I could just bring Michael's attention to the chat. Michael, there is a couple of questions there specifically for you. So if you wouldn't mind answering those in the chat while Jeremy does the talk about the waiver, that would be amazing. Thank you.
Oh, just a second. I did see a number from Gordon. I'm just scrolling through trying to find them.
Yeah.
It's just it's popping a lot quicker than, than I'm used to.
It is. That
okay,
would be
cool.
great.
I'll send them to you, Michael. I'll send them to you specifically so you can see them.
Okay, well, I've got them right here, Gordon. That's fine.
Thank
So how
you,
would the
guys.
accreditation be monitored? Well, what
My-
we'd be looking to do would be similar to other accreditations, where there would very likely be a site inspection, and then there would be a report generated that would go to like an accreditation council that would make a judgment about accreditation. And we still need to test all of these things through consultation. For example, what that accreditation council would look like and how long accreditation would be valid for. Second question about consolidation of HRECs. I'm not advocating for consolidation of HRECs, but certainly with these standards and what we've been tasked with is to aim for a very high standard of integrity and ethics review. And it may be the case that not every one of the 200 HRECs in Australia will be able to make that without some changes, or consolidation is one option open to them. So, but I'm not actively advocating for consolidation. I just think it's an interesting model for them to get to what they need to do. You're right in that chairs don't make decisions about the about individual application, but the HREC does. So an independent chair is fine, but I feel that chair quality is a much better indicator. Certainly, I mean, within the quality standards, we do leave it up to the institution to appoint and decide on a chair, but they do have to have the paper trail about why this chair is suitable for their particular role, and have they done any evaluation for that particular position. But as I said, for other things, this is open to input from the public as to how an institution might decide whether a chair is suitable for the position. I hope that answers your questions, but I'd be willing to take any others in the time that's remaining.
I'm going to hand
Jumping
over
back
to
to-
Jeremy to do
yeah.
the waivers.
Yeah.
And Gordon, if you blow up the chat, that's fine. But people reply to Gordon on the chat while he's blowing it up.
Right. And I just would like to say to follow on Michael's comment, just one brief comment, and that is that although it's being referred to as HREC accreditation, anyone who's reviewed the material will understand that much of the criteria are actually related to the institution rather than the HREC. So it's actually accreditation of institutions and their HRECs, not HRECs. It's just shorthand to say HREC accreditation. And that's the same as the NHMRC certification system as well, which does not certify HRECs, it certifies institutions. So on the waiver point, the many of the issues that we face with waiver, apart from the ethical ones, but the sort of administrative ones, are a function of the advent of privacy legislation 20 years ago, which assigned to the HREC the role of assessing whether a waiver was appropriate or not, and the criteria for making that determination. And that was because at the time, healthcare institutions, never mind other institutions, didn't have any other infrastructure, any other group that could reasonably have made that judgment. And so it was assigned to the HREC. In many people's view, that was an error because HRECs are not designed to assess compliance with legislation or guidelines that are derived from legislation, regulatory type things. And so everybody had to adapt. And as a consequence, when we were considering in the national statement who needed to approve waivers, we were stuck because if the privacy legislation said it had to be HRECs, we couldn't say that it doesn't have to be HRECs. And so we designed the waiver section to say in 2.3.9, if certain kinds of information are used, read, if privacy guidelines are implicated, then it has to be the HREC because that's what the legislation says, or that's what the guideline says. We didn't want to write it that way. We had to write it that way. But we also wanted to create an option. And if you look at 2.3.10, it says, if that information is not what's involved in the project, then a non-HREC ethics review body or process can be used to grant the waiver. And so it depends on the nature of the project as to who grants the waiver. But we all understand that a lot of the difficulties flow around the requirement that certain kinds of, if the research involves certain kinds of information, it has to be reviewed by the HREC. But what if it's a low risk review project, right? And we want, in theory, we want HRECs to devote themselves to greater than low risk research, review of that, not low risk research, to ease their workload and to use their expertise most effectively. So if there are low risk review processes that are outside of the HREC, which I would argue they should be, rather than a delegation from the HREC or even a subcommittee of the HREC, but most people use those latter systems. If that's the case, who approves the waiver? If you have two people from an HREC approving a project, a low risk review project, and there's a waiver involved, does that constitute HREC approval? No, it doesn't. Right. And so what do you do about that? And so there are various workarounds. People started to create various workarounds, one of which is that the HREC, if it's low risk review, but there's a waiver, it essentially becomes within the HREC purview, and the low risk review process is not used. The second is the HREC research process is used to review the project, and there's even a decision about the waiver, and then is ratified by the HREC at the next meeting. A third one, and I think the one most commonly used perhaps, is that the low risk review process goes forward, the project is reviewed, except for the waiver decision, which is then reviewed by itself by the HREC without reviewing the whole project, so that piece of the review is done sort of in partnership with the low risk review process, and the decision is made by the HREC or some delegation from the HREC. We do not monitor whether the processes are pure and whether they perfectly adhere to guidelines or legislation. We couldn't do that anyway, but we're certainly aware that there are different models for how to do this, and there are various institutions, Royal Children's among them, has been very creative in how they do this. And everybody's trying to be responsible and do the right thing, but we're also not trying to have all sorts of low risk review having to be done by the HREC because of the waiver issue. Unfortunately, until the privacy guidelines are reformed, are redesigned, there's no way out of this. There's no.
Can I just ask a question, Jeremy, about this this point in 2.3.10, where it says where a waiver that's not, I interpret it as a waiver that doesn't apply under the Privacy Act, that we're not considering as a waiver that needs to apply to the Privacy Act, can be reviewed by another committee. Is it then,
or another process,
another process? Are we applying the criteria of the waiver to those, or is that
absolutely?
Yes. So we're applying that.
The 2.3.10 criteria would apply to both those waivers that would be reviewed essentially in parallel with the privacy guidelines, and those that would be reviewed under a low risk model that don't implicate privacy legislation. That is the intent of the section.
Yeah, and I think
obviously there's some issues there.
Well, I think the confusion comes with not knowing what data needs to be considered under the Privacy Act, or what is actually exempt, because it might be an audit process that happens within the institution. And I think I see one of the biggest complexities is around multi-site review, accepting and reviewing waivers from other institutions. And now with everybody has got a much higher interest in privacy when it comes to reviewing and dealing with privacy complaints. If we don't get it under the right framework, if we refer to 2.3.10 for justifications, because if it's something that may not be requiring a waiver, then we end up in trouble when people come and approach us around how we've used their data.
Right.
So
So obviously there are a number of issues here, some of which deals with the ethics governance line, and and how that all works with respect to waiver, and it makes it agreed, it makes it problematic, and so certain creative solutions may be required. I would say though that to some degree, if you're going to pick and choose which pieces of HREC review you consider to be acceptable and not acceptable for the purposes of acceptance under a single ethics review model, and I don't mean NMA necessarily. Single ethics review is something that can be done outside of NMA and outside of certification and outside of anything else, and has been done since time immemorial, I might add. It's not a new thing. But if you're going to sort of cherry pick which ones you're going to accept and which not, it does undermine the system. And with respect to single ethics review, we have to understand that the perfect is the enemy of the good. And that is, you have to accept that things will be sometimes imperfect in order for the system to be workable. And if everybody's making exceptions all the time, the system, you know, does not function properly.
I think that I mean, like, you know, that we do an institutional risk meeting after we consider any waivers. But one of the problems we have is when we have another site approving a waiver of consent for what would involve four cases at our site. And
Yes.
the impracticability criteria cannot be met here. So we would not accept that
Right.
as requiring a waiver.
And there's another thing that people often miss, which is that for some research projects, if there are 100 people involved and 95 of them, there's no way to obtain access to them. They're lost to follow up, or they're dead, or whatever. Then you have an argument for waiver for those 95, but the remaining 5 that you could reach, waiver is not appropriate. You
No.
have to get consent from them.
Correct.
I would also add that the opt-out approach is not a form of consent. It's also not a form of waiver. It is something that sits in between, and the Privacy Act considers it to be not, it doesn't even recognize it as an entity. It's not considered a type of consent. Opt-out consent is a misnomer. It is an alternative to consent. Equally, it's not exactly a waiver, but it functions under privacy legislation a bit like a waiver. And so that reduces the applicability of that approach to things. But I understand the issues of
Yeah, I think this might
single
be a
ethics review.
project
And
that,
of course, remember that no one thought of this. No one thought of the implications for the single ethics review
yeah.
concept when they designed either the privacy guidelines or the waiver bits in the national statement. So it's an issue that someday will need to be resolved.
I think this is an area where we could maybe look at sending around some scenarios and getting a litmus test on how everyone's reviewing them. I think another big thing would be to really clarify what the waiver is for, because often researchers misinterpret when they've got a waiver and they think, I've got a waiver, I can do whatever I want. So I think one of the things that would be really good is if, as a community, we really clarified what we're giving a waiver for when we provide a waiver, so that it's really clear on the approval letter or some other area that we are not just giving a waiver, because it's not very
there's
detailed.
one other point I'd like to make here, and that is that the waiver is for the waiver of the requirement for consent, right? And you have to remember that if there is no requirement for consent in the first place, there is no need for a waiver, right? You only need a waiver if it is required.
And it's
people
even
often miss
complicated
this one.
Yeah, but
right?
overseas privacy legislation views it differently. So they say, we need a waiver, and we're like, that's not a waiver. So I think it is very complex. Gordon, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. Look, great stuff, Jeremy. I mean, I think this is a kind of complex area, and as you say, some things weren't envisaged. Can I just pivot slightly to 5.1.17 and data and exemption and its intersection with waiver? And you may or may not have been on yesterday, but you know, if I go to a health service and I ask them for non-identifiable data and they give me non-identifiable data, 5.1.17 then says, because they've given me non-identifiable data, and just say I'm not going to link it and I'm going to treat it properly, I shouldn't have to get a waiver, because in actual fact, that's exempt from review. Is that the correct interpretation, or am I?
Well, the first thing I would say is nothing is definitionally exempt from review. Exemption from review is a decision made by an organization, an institution, that something is exempt. So what you are actually asking for when you apply for an exemption is you're saying, this is eligible for exemption. I'm asking you to grant me that exemption. Okay, and the institution could say for various reasons that even though the project is otherwise eligible for exemption for a variety of reasons, which it may state or may not, we will not grant an exemption in an instance. So that may be one way that an institution deals with that particular issue. But I don't think that thought was actually given to the intersection of the exemption criteria and the waiver. I would say that if a waiver is required, I think that does put it outside of eligibility for exemption
Yep.
criteria. I think that has to be pretty clear.
No, thanks, Jeremy. It's just it's a live debate.
I
That
mean,
one.
but then the question is, do you need waivers for de-identified information? And people have different opinions about that, and that's part of the problem.
Yeah, and I'll answer that question, the last one in the chat, before we sign off, because we discussed this yesterday. So this question has come up about how did the organisation access the data to give you?
Yes,
So did they need a
yes.
waiver for de-identification?
Yes,
And I would
yes,
say that
yes.
falls under the organisation's governance framework. So the organisation may have a governance framework that says, you know, for this, we will, people who ordinarily access that data can remove the identifiers in order to do these things. So that organisation is not disclosing data to a third party. So it's not identifiable information. I mean, Andrea may argue it could be re-identifiable information that came into the chat yesterday. But what they're saying is, what Gordon's example was, they're not disclosing identifiable information to a third party. So there's no overlay of the Privacy Act, because all of that de-identification happened within the same organisation who was already the custodian of the data.
And I would agree with
correct?
that interpretation as well.
Yeah, so that's how we interpret it. Everybody, this is a hot topic, and I think that from a reg officer and HREC perspective, we could talk about this for a lot longer. So I think what we might do is put this on our list of things to address. And if anybody who's been on our panel today would like to take part in that discussion and workshop, we'd obviously love to have you, but we will work towards that for our March visit. And now I'm going to hand over to my colleague and friend Sarah to wrap everything up. Thanks, everyone.
It's actually Courtney today, so take over, Courtney.
Just thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today, and a huge thank you to our presenters and everyone who helped facilitate the session. It's been amazing. So if you would like to join the National Community of Practice Teams group, the Ethics and Governance Community of Practice, I'm a newbie, so I can highly recommend joining the group. Please ask a question on the Teams group or share resources. So if you would like to get in touch with our leadership group, please contact Sarah or Sophie. I think Sarah was going to put their emails in the chat, but she's also put in the link to join the mailing list or Teams. And she's also put in a link for the registration. As Sophie mentioned earlier, the next event will be the 5th of March, 2025. So we'd love to hear from you and see you then. Thanks so much for engaging with us, and we look forward to seeing you soon.